Hello, everyone. This is iBookBinding's live stream, and we continue our series of talks dedicated to Booker Prize bindings. Today we have Glenn Malkin. Hi, Glenn. Nice to have you here.
Hi, good to see you.
My co-host is Pavel Voronin. Pavel joins us from CRBF. Hi, Pavel.
Hi, everyone.
As Glenn is first time on our live stream, we wanted to start with a bit of biography or something like that, the self-introduction. I just wanted to mention that, Glenn, you were the person who got to bind the winner's book for Booker, right? That's correct?
Absolutely, yeah. They clearly gave that to me on purpose, I'm sure.
Congrats on that. Congrats on that win.
It's funny, everybody's been congratulating me as if I'm the one that's won the Booker Prize, but hey, yes. I don't mind taking the glory.
Well, okay, we'll talk about it a bit later. We almost always ask our guests to say a couple of words about their path to bookbinding. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. I got into bookbinding quite late. I was in my mid-40s because I've now been bookbinding professionally for I think it's 17 years now. And it was a career change for me. Before that, I was a leadership development consultant, teaching leadership skills to businesses and so on. So it was a very, very different kind of world. But I kind of got disillusioned with that and I wanted to do something more creative. I quite fancied working on my own as well. I started looking around to see what I could do. And people often ask me how I came to bookbinding, and I still can't give an answer to that. I actually found it online. I was looking for different kinds of courses to do. I quite fancied being an architectural model maker. I thought that would be quite interesting to do. But it turns out you have to be an architect in order to do that. So that was not going to happen.
Surprise, surprise.
Yeah. So I was just looking at other things, and I just happened to come across a course in bookbinding, and it was with a guy called Alan Fitch, who's a bookbinder in the eastern region of the UK. And I went to see him, and that was in 2007. And that was the first time I'd even thought about binding a book, and I started from scratch. I knew absolutely nothing about it. In fact, I remember at the time I didn't even realize, I don't think, that books were sewn. So, I was an absolute beginner. Interestingly, I did know on that first week-long course that I did that this is what I wanted to do. I think it was on the second or third day, I said to Alan that, this is going to change my life. And he was not unreasonably a little bit dismissive of that, but it really did. It was a real light bulb moment. Well, he came through the printing route. He was a printer first off, and then he eventually got into bookbinding, and he taught a lot of people. I mean, teaching was Alan's big thing. He's sort of semi-retired now, does a little bit, but he's still involved in the Society of Bookbinders. So I see him quite often. Actually, I'm still good friends with Alan. But that was in April 2007, and by January 2008, I'd gone full time as a bookbinder. It was that quick. Having said that, I didn't make any money for a long time because, of course, during that period, although I was doing it full time, I was practicing and I was learning and so on.
You worked as your own person in your own workshop from the start.
Absolutely, yes.
But that's extremely fast. Could you please not gloss over that? How you done it so fast? That's a dream for lots of people.
Well, I just couldn't stop making books. So I just, I wanted to change my career, and I knew that I had to really go for it. So it was a big decision, to give up what was a quite well-paid job and go into something that I knew I wasn't going to earn much money with. But it was the best thing I ever did because the work-life balance thing just changed totally for me. And, I say now, I still don't really work for a living. I glue bits of paper together. It's hardly going down the coal mines, is it? So it's not hard work, and it's just fun, really. And it's just able to pay the bills from the work that I enjoy doing. As I say, it took me a long time to get to the point where I was starting to get customers, and it was a continual process of learning. I was going on as many courses and tuition programs that I could find. And during that process, quite early in that process, I met Paul Delrue in the Western region of the Society of Bookbinders, and he introduced me to design bindings. And quite quickly, I spent a little bit of time with him and with a lot of help from him, made my first design binding and realized that this was a totally different thing to get into, but I loved it. So it was very artistic, very creative. And yes, there were a lot of technical skills involved, but ultimately it's an art form. So I enjoyed doing that. And I therefore developed my routine book repair type business alongside my design bindings. I gained some success with design bindings quite early on. I think my first prize that I won was in 2009. So it was only a year later in the Designer Bookbinders competition. So that gave me a lot of encouragement. And I just went on from there. But I think the thing is, at the beginning, I thought I was on a 20-year learning curve. You know, I thought it's going to take me a long time. And I realized now that that was nowhere near long enough. You know, we're all still on this learning curve. It never finishes. And that's one of the nice things about it, really. I suppose the next thing was my development through Designer Bookbinders. I became a licentiate of Designer Bookbinders because I knew I wanted to pursue the design binding side of things. I can't quite remember the year. I think it was 2013, something like that. And I actually failed to be accepted on my first application. I know, shock, horror, who'd have thought? But it was actually quite a useful experience once you get over the disappointment, because you get very good feedback and it points you in the direction of where you need to develop. So I had a lot of support from the fellows at Designer Bookbinders and worked hard to improve. And I eventually became a licentiate. I think it was 2014, something like that. As a licentiate, you then are allocated a couple of formal mentors, although you can speak to any of the fellows, of course. And you develop your skill with their help and support over a period of 5 to 7 years, typically, when you can then apply to become a fellow, which is what I did. It was a slight interruption because of COVID, but I applied. I can't remember what year it was actually, but I applied to become fellow. And again, I was rejected on my first attempt. And once again, it was a little bit crushing, I have to say. I really wasn't happy, but nevertheless, when I eventually sort of sat back and thought about it and then started looking at the feedback I got and talking to my mentors about it, firstly, it was absolutely the right decision that they made. I wasn't ready. But the feedback I got was superb because, again, I could focus more on how to develop. And I particularly Dominic Riley gave me some superb feedback. And I spent a little bit of time with him going through various, just tiny little technical details sometimes, but those things matter at that level. So I then applied again a year later and was successful. So I became a fellow in 2022. And that then opens up sort of a number of opportunities. And one of those opportunities is the ability to apply to do the Booker Prize binding. You're not really supposed to do it, or you're not really allowed to do it in the first year or two of being a fellow. But after that, then you can apply, which is what I did last year. And
so it was your first opportunity to do that.
It was indeed, yes. So the process is that you, as a fellow, you apply to the organizer, which is Angela James, and she takes all those names that people have put forward who would like to do the Booker, and she picks from those 6 binders to do it. And obviously it depends who's done it before and so on and so forth. So she tries to give everybody an equal opportunity. That happened just before the long list for Booker was announced. So when the long list was announced, the 12 books, I went through the summaries of each of the stories and the books to get a feel for them and see if there's any in there that I particularly would like to do. And interestingly, Orbital was number 1 on my list. I was really pleased to get that. But I said to Angela, you know, if it's shortlisted and if I get the opportunity and nobody else wants it, then I would really like to do Orbital. So that's what happened. I admit one of the reasons for that is it's the shortest. It's the shortest book of the lot. I think it's the second shortest book in Booker history. That it was, and part of that reason is particularly being my first time. I didn't want to spend a long time reading it because, of course, you get the book, you have to read it to come up with a design, and when you've only got a few weeks to do that in, you know, one thing I didn't want to do is have to spend a week reading a book because I'm quite a slow reader. It was very fortuitous with that. And with this book, I read it in less than 2 days. So, yeah, it was ideal for me.
We have a question from Paul Sterling. Does Glenn consider he has any natural artistic abilities?
It's a very good question, actually. I mean, I think I'm of the belief that everybody has the ability to be artistic. I think what is interesting is everybody might do that in a different way. It might approach that in a different way. It might be just different media. I mean, I can't draw. I'd be hopeless at drawing a face or something. I have in the past done a little bit of watercolor painting, just as a hobby, and not very much. But other than that, and I've never done any artistic work at all, really. It's funny because I think sometimes it goes back to childhood. My brother was always considered the artistic one, and indeed he is. He's a professional artist. I was always considered the academic one. Looking back, I'm not sure why, but that's, my parents saw me as the academic one. So I wasn't necessarily pushed in the artistic direction at a young age. So it's something that came to me much later on. But I wouldn't say it comes to me easily. I think, I have to work at it. And I think there's an element of self-confidence involved in it. But I truly think everybody has the ability to be artistic. It's just that their application of that might differ from somebody else's. It's a good question.
Thank you, Paul. Should we start the presentation?
Well, let me just show you one thing first, because what might be of interest to people is the process I go through when I come up with the design. Once I've got the book, they send you just a version, which is a reading version. So they sent me just a little paperback version of the book, as well as the sheets to be printed. So I was reading the book, and we all do it differently, I guess. But the way I do this is I have a pen and paper next to me when I'm reading. And if something jumps out of the page to me that might just strike a chord, even if it doesn't make any sense initially, then I write it down, or I do a couple of sketches. So I've got, this is the piece of paper that I had next to me. And all I've written down there are a few words or a sentence or so that are from the book that I thought, that might make a nice image. And so I just scribble them down, and then sometimes a few little sketches and things. I just work on that, and I just keep going. So as I read throughout the book, I might write 2 or 3 pages of those different ideas and things, and I'll keep coming back to them. So, for example, what have I got here? It's as an example of some of the sentences that jumped out at me. The aurora domes the southern horizon in neon. So you immediately got shapes and colours coming into that. Another sentence says, the Milky Way, a smoky trail of gunpowder. Another one says, space shreds time to pieces. So just things that stand out that I think maybe I can, hang something on that. And often that's how I come up with ideas. There's an idea there, which is a sort of, you probably can't see it, but there's a sort of a fractal kind of sketch there, a bit like an ammonite. The main ideas that I started working up were down to the fact that in the book is set over a 24-hour period. And during that 24-hour period, it's the International Space Station where it is set. It basically orbits the Earth 16 times. And the book is simple in some respects because it doesn't have a lot of plot, essentially. The book is really what the astronauts are experiencing up there as they circle around, and what they can see and what they're thinking and how they experience time going by. Ultimately, I started focusing on this idea of 16 orbits. And I thought basically, how can I represent those 16 orbits? And I thought, well, I could have 16 Earths on the image. Again, more sketches, more sort of rough ideas of how those 16 Earths could be represented. And of course, you then think, well, it's got to go across the front and the back of the book. It's not just on the front. So again, just little sketches about how I might actually present that, and these sort of different shapes, and it wasn't really working. Essentially, the idea I got in my head, I found really difficult to put onto paper, and I mused on these ideas for some time. And for me, this is often the longest part of the process. It can take weeks to come up with the design. And I just keep sketching and keep playing with these ideas until something comes up. And often the end result is very different.
But now there is a timer there.
Exactly, yes. So it's a very different process. But I was really lucky because, as often happens with me, it sounds a bit weird, this, but more often than not, probably, I come up with ideas in my sleep. And so I'm in bed and I'm thinking about it when I go to bed very often, just sort of musing on some of these ideas. And in the middle of the night, I'll have an idea. And luckily, I tend to remember them, which it would be a bit awful if I couldn't, but I tend to remember these ideas. And the idea I came up with was having these 16 representations of the Earth, 8 on the front and 8 on the back. And that's what I ended up doing. It was much easier to execute than some of the other alternatives I'd been thinking about. It was quicker to execute in some respect, and time was certainly an issue here. And I had more confidence that I would be able to do it successfully. So that's what I did. And to some extent, I think there's always an element of keep it simple. Simple is often best. You can overcomplicate things sometimes. So that's really where we started.
At this point, this nighttime, midnight idea of yours, was it in terms of shapes? Did you know just what you wanted it to look like, or did you have the whole project as an idea, like how to achieve it?
Yeah, no, not necessarily. I think probably 75% of it was there. Most of the ideas were there, I think. Some of the implementation of it, some of how I would achieve the effect that I wanted, would have to be thought about. But I knew that I could do it. And it takes some elements of bindings that I've done before and I applied them to this. So I knew that I could achieve the techniques involved. So yeah, it was largely there, but it is quite, on this occasion, thankfully, it's quite a quick process to come up with the final design. It took a couple of days, or 2 or 3 days probably. So I could then crack on with it straight away. I just thinking, if we look at the first photo, Pavel, that shows the finished binding with its box.
While Pavel is figuring out how to do PowerPoint, I will read another comment. Maria Rozakina joined us, a colleague of ours from Moscow, who now lives and works in London. Just want to point out that I find Glenn very talented in terms of artistic ability. I was sure that you were a professional artist.
It is interesting because quite a few fellows of Designer Bookbinders do come through the art college route. They do have an artistic background like that. That's certainly not the case for me. Well, I mean, don't tell anybody, but I tend to generally go for the easiest options very often in my bindings. They may look complex, but they're relatively straightforward to achieve. And that's always a secret to it, I think. Like I say, I think you can get overcomplicated if you're not careful. I come up with loads of fantastic ideas to do a binding and then realize there's no way that I'm going to be able to actually achieve it and implement it. Frequently, I end up totally changing what I want to do. This is the finished book. This is the book Orbital, and you can see there the front cover with the 6 earths, if you like, on there, and there are 6 similar ones on the back, which we'll see in a moment. And for my design bindings, I always make a wooden box as well. So you can see there the leather panel on the front of the wooden box.
Do you make the wooden box yourself, or do you have a...
I do. No, I make them myself to fit the book, yes. And there's sort of a suede-lined wooden box.
And on the box is this sort of BBC shot from space, planet Earth.
It is a little, isn't it? Yeah. Well, again, there's numerous references in the book about looking at the horizon and whether it's looking at the aurora or just the atmosphere. So I thought it was a perfect opportunity to incorporate that into the design. And you'll see the title Orbital is just blind tooled on the front as well. What you get from from the Booker Foundation, is a set of specially printed sheets like this, which is really nice because they didn't used to. Some years ago, you just used to get a copy of the sewn book. I don't think it was bound, but you had to take out the sewing and take it apart and so on. So it's nice now that they produce these. There's some decent quality paper. The grain direction is correct. Plenty of margin for you to trim down. And there were several blank sheets as well, should I want to use those for end papers, for example. So that's where we started. That's the book that I've just shown you. So that's the paperback version of it. And again, sometimes you can get ideas and things from the bindings that are on the published books.
Everybody always reads the book fully before binding. I wonder if eventually somebody will go down the improvisational route, like come up with it as you go.
Well, who knows? I mean, it's certainly possible. I know a lot of people actually read the book multiple times. As I say, I'm a slow reader, so I couldn't do that, I don't think, not in the time scale. So I think the truth is, if it was a very hefty book, like Wolf Hall or something like that, then I think if you're a slow reader like I am, maybe you may struggle to get through it all and still give yourself plenty of time. You'd certainly still read some of it. You'd certainly skim it. you'd certainly look at the summaries that are available for the story, which, you know, are online and on the Booker website. You can look at the interviews that are done with the authors and various other resources that will help you with it. So I think that, you know, there will be occasions when maybe that does happen, but you can't beat actually reading the book.
I mean it not in a derogative way, but as a method. Imagine the binding being forced to change the whole concept because of a twist that comes towards the end, and you're almost done, and now you have to do something.
Yeah. No, it's a fair point. It's a fair point. I think that the problem is if you don't read it, then you potentially have the possibility that your binding doesn't relate to the subject of the book. And it needs to have that connection. Absolutely. So here we see the book was sewn onto 4 tapes and rounded and backed. Although it was quite a thin book, I think there were 10 sections, so plus the end paper. So there's plenty of sections to round and back. And I've just filled in between the tapes there with a piece of mull, I think it is, just to level it off a little bit. Then we've got the edges decorated. I've just sponged on acrylic ink, and I've sprinkled it with gold leaf and then polished it with Renaissance wax. The key to successful edge decoration, I think, is preparation, and it needs to be ploughed and then sanded to a mirror finish. It needs to be absolutely smooth to get the best results. There's so many different techniques that you could choose from as well. You know, the technique you choose to go with the book and with the binding that you're doing.
Anton Bukovsky wrote, Glenn, you know very well that Delrue famously couldn't read one of the books he bound, so just did an abstract design.
Yeah, I mean, Paul Delrue was unique. Let's just put it like that. I mean, you can recognize his bindings a mile off, but very often he didn't read the books. No, he absolutely. He'll know what they were about, but yeah, he didn't always read them.
Sort of related question, and maybe related to your process. Jill Lauriston on YouTube asks, does Glenn ever use audiobooks instead of reading them?
I don't actually, no. I wouldn't rule that out as a way of doing it, actually. It's being a slow reader, it could well be an opportunity to understand the content of the book. It's just not something I've got into, to be honest. I don't think I've ever listened to an audiobook in my life, but I wouldn't rule that out, certainly. Yeah, we got to the edge decoration end, full core end band with a figure of 8 type sewing on it. It's I actually do this for almost every binding that I do because I think it looks nice. It's not really very clear on that image perhaps, but that sort of double core looks really nice. And I actually find this the easiest type of end band to do. The flat core at the back is a piece of leather with a little bit of vellum glued to it to give it a bit of stiffness. Okay. And the little round core at the front is actually a couple of strands of hemp cord, not a full hemp cord, that would be too thick. So okay. I take it apart and just get a couple of strands. And then I rub that with PVA to make it stiff. And then that's what I use for the small core at the front. You'll also notice on the left of that photograph that I actually I glue and tie the two together at the left-hand side, which helps hold everything in place whilst I'm working it. That's the end band. That's the forwarded book. A number of things to point out here is I see that the surface of the cover has been sanded, and you can see the tapes near the spine. And that's because I recess the tapes into the front of the board. They don't go through the board. They're just recessed in and glued in position, and then linings put on top. Now, this is a technique that Paul Delrue used, which is why I use it, and it works for me. So you don't have any problems with having to flatten the boards on the inside where the tape comes through or recess the tape or anything like that. Provided you've got sufficient tapes on there, it holds in place really, really well. I've never had a problem with the board coming loose or anything like that. You'll also see the edges of the boards are chamfered. The board in the middle is probably, a little over 2 millimeters thick. But I always chamfer the edges because it gives it a much more delicacy, much more refined finish when the edge is maybe 1 to 1.5 millimeters thick. So it feels like it's a narrower board without actually losing the strength. I always do that. The other thing on the spine is that I use a 3/4 hollow. Now, a 3/4 hollow, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's a standard, if you imagine a standard 1-on, 2-off hollow, the 2 centimeters at the top and at the bottom, the 1-on part of the hollow has been cut away. So it doesn't go right up to the ends. we have the end bands, and the tie downs are secured by a thin piece of leather. Were anybody to look down in the spine, in the hollow, you'd see a little piece of leather there attached to the end bands. On a thin book like this, nobody would ever see that. But on a thick book where you might actually look down the hollow, you would actually see that leather. And so that's a little bit of a refinement, a little bit of a delicacy again. Importantly, I think, and this is something that I got from Mark Cockram, that the one-on part of the hollow is just attached directly to the spine without any further linings. Mm-hmm. So you don't flatten the spine, you don't get rid of the lumps, you just put the hollow on. Mm-hmm. And the flattening of the hollow happens on the outside. So the hollow went on, and then I covered the outer part of the hollow with watercolor paper. Mm-hmm. And sanded that. So any lumps as a result of the tapes will be removed on the outside of the hollow. Now, the benefit of that is that the book opens better because there are less linings actually attached to the spine. You're not getting the stiffness that would sometimes create. The book actually opens better than it might otherwise do. It's a nice technique. As I say, I learned it from Mark Cockram, but I know it's been used for a long time, I think, by various people. But it's a technique I use on all of my design bindings now. In fact, on most of my bindings. It's a really nice way of doing things. I really like it when it gets to this stage, when the book is fully forwarded and it's ready for its leather. Before I do any decorative work on the leather, I do the edge pairing. And I use a combination of tools for this. I have a sharp fix, which I often use, my English and French paring knives, and a spoke shave. It depends what mood I'm in sometimes as to which tool I use to do the edge pairing.
What do you use as a surface for pairing?
I just use a litho stone. It's reasonable size, actually. It is, yeah. It's probably slightly bigger than A3 size. In fact, I think it used to be David Sellers, actually. So yes, I do my pairing on there. And with this particular binding, it was important that the leather on the center of the boards was full thickness, because I was going to be inserting those circles into it, and I wanted to actually see the thickness of the leather on the cover, which we'll come to later. You may also just be able to see the lines which represent where the spine is there. I always thin my joints, and usually what I do with joints is I actually sand them. I have a dowel or a cardboard tube which goes underneath the leather, and then I use a sanding block and a coarse abranet or coarse sanding paper, and I sand away the joints. You get a nice smooth effect there. So I just find that the easiest and quickest and most repeatable way to do that.
How do you fight all these leather shavings, and not only shavings, because when you just sand it, it's leather dust.
It's a nightmare. What I should have is what a lot of people have, which is a special pairing station where they have sort of little walls around their pairing stone so we can collect it all and hoover it up. But no, I just make a mess. And then I have to get the hoover out every 2 minutes to hoover it all up.
We had a video with a visit to Peter Garrity's workshop in the US and Massachusetts, and he not only had a special pairing station, he had a whole pairing room.
Really?
Yeah, but
it's a sensible thing.
Yeah. But it was a huge workshop. Yeah.
Well, I have a theory that it doesn't matter how big your binder is; it's never big enough. After I paired the leather, that's when I can do my decorative techniques. And the first thing I wanted to do was put essentially a representation of the Milky Way diagonally across the leather. It was actually a very dark blue leather, this. It looks black, but it was actually very dark blue. But I airbrushed in this photo, the top right and the bottom left corners with almost black ink. So I airbrushed that so there's a bit of a gradient. And then in the middle, I used white ink to produce the airbrushed effect of the Milky Way. This is an example of one of those fortuitous accidents as well. It's very difficult to apply white ink with an airbrush on a dark background. Acrylic ink is too transparent. There is a professional acrylic ink that Fiebings do, which I've got, which is very thick. In fact, it's too thick to use in an airbrush. So what I did is I mixed a bit of that with a bit of white acrylic ink and tried to get the consistency appropriate for the airbrush, and I used that. But as a result of that, what I actually ended up is getting a little bit of paint spatter from the airbrush. And if you look very carefully, there are tiny little spots all over it. Mm-hmm. And there. And actually, it was a fortuitous effect because it looks like stars. Really pleased with the result when it came out. And it's far better than it would have been had it just been a sort of a smooth application there. So I was pleased with that fortuitous mistake, really. That's the way things go.
It's a perfect moment to read another comment from Ruth Brown. Glenn is brilliant at airbrushing on leather.
Thanks, Ruth. Airbrushing is a technique I use on most of my bindings. Sometimes it's just a touch of airbrushing to give a bit of a gradient. I think part of the thing is, for me, I don't like to see flat colour on a binding. If it was a red leather or something, I don't like to see it when it's just all the same red. More often than not, I put some kind of gradient on there, which may be quite subtle, but it just lifts the interest for me a little bit. It's an important technique that I learned some years ago, and I use it a lot. I really do.
About some traditional tooling, like 18th and 19th century style tooling?
Tooling is not my forte. Anybody who knows me well will know that. And my wife will certainly tell you, because if I'm doing any tooling, I usually come in swearing, because it never goes well. Yeah, I do a bit, to be fair, but it's absolutely not my forte. So I try to limit it as much as I can. So this is the same leather on the book. So the book is now fully bound, looking fine, but of course I've got to do the doublures and the insides, and then I got to get to the point where I have to start cutting holes in that, and that's quite a scary moment.
By that stage, how much time did you spend with this book already? And how much time did you have left?
I was actually fortuitous, because I managed to come up with the design, read the book and come up with the design quite quickly. I ended up completing the book about a week in advance of the deadline, which surprised me, but I was very pleased at that. I like to have that time to do that. So this was probably a week into the thing, thereabouts, maybe a bit more. There you can see the inside of the book. The end papers I added had got a sewn-in cloth joint, which is what you can see there attached to the inside of the board. So that's attached first, and then the next thing on the next slide is filling that in between the leather and then overlaying some good quality watercolour paper and sanding that back. It's really important in a binding of this level that you get absolutely flat doublures. So there should be no lumps or dips or anything like that in the doublure. So this part of the process is quite critical. And you'll see that the watercolor paper actually goes to within a couple of millimeters of the edge of the board.
What do you usually do with the turn-ins at the corners?
The turn-ins at the corners, I use a technique which I learned from Don Etherington, actually. And it wasn't even personally, it was from a video I saw of Don Etherington, where he showed how to cut the corners using the corner of the board as a guide. Mm-hmm. And you go at an angle about 30 degrees, creating a sort of little chamfer on the leather. Mm-hmm. And you cut a little nick out of where the corner is and fold them in. And they just basically go together nicely. And you get very few lumps doing it that way. However, having said that, because I use edge-to-edge doublures on this, it doesn't matter if there's a bit of a lump, because I just pare it off with a paring knife. I don't have to protect the leather on the inside in that way. So often I will just use a scalpel or a French paring knife just to take off any little lumps that are still there on the corners. And then putting this watercolor paper on the top and sanding it off, that allows you to get an absolutely flat surface. That's the insides done, and the doublures aren't on yet. This is the scary part, yeah. I made a little template which shows where the circles are on the board. So this piece of paper was the same size as the board. Some holes with sticky tape over so I could position this on the board. And that allowed me to use a needle to see where the center of the holes are. In fact, on the bottom circles, you can see a little mark in the center there. That's how I was able to get them positioned correctly, because I marked it out on that paper template first. I then cut out the circles using just a circle cutter, which is a real simple, cheap device, but it's just like a compass with a blade, and works really well. And because the board has been lined with paper, those circles then just peel out really nicely.
Is there some kind of rule of thumb for how close to the edge you can cut? How much between the holes? Because those are the scary bits.
Yeah, absolutely. If there is a rule of thumb, I've no idea what it is. I just had to guess. You're absolutely right, though. You don't want to go too close to the edge because you want it to be secure. But equally, I wanted to get a decent sized circle, so it would need to go quite close to the edge. I think at the top and bottom, I was certainly less than a centimetre away from the edge. I don't know whether that was a good idea or not. I took those off, and the same on the back as well. And then I needed to fill them. Here is the leather, or one of the pieces of leather. This was natural goat. So it's a fair goat, this sort of beige coloured goat, which at first I coloured blue with acrylic ink, and then I used craquel as a technique to produce these sort of effects. So there's a combination of craquel, there's some sponging going on there. I actually did several of these. So there's several of these pieces of leather. You'll see also that on these finished ones that I also then painted on. I did it actually with cotton bud or Q-tip, painted onto white, which I wanted to effectively mimic clouds in the atmosphere. It was never intended to be an accurate representation of the Earth. It was purely illustrative, purely representative, I suppose, of what the astronauts could see looking out of their windows. They wouldn't often see the whole Earth, they just see part of it anyway. So it was just sort of random colours, greens, blues, browns and whites, really. So I made several of these and I cut out many, many circles and then picked the best ones.
I thought those weren't like whole Earth. I thought that those were meant to be views you get from those circular windows.
Yeah, I think you're right. It wasn't ever meant to be the whole Earth, really. It was just the views that they were seeing. You know, these are some that didn't make the cut. You know, just different sort of illustrations, and the different colours, the different craquel effect that I got on them allowed me to pick ones that were different but worked together. Here what I did is, that's the back of the circles on the left there, but I arranged them so that I was happy with the order they were in and that they there weren't two that were very similar next to each other, that kind of thing. So I numbered them all so I knew which was going where. The circles that were being inlaid are smaller than the circles I cut out, so that they would leave a little channel around them, which, as you can see, I painted blue just with acrylic paint. The reason for that is just so that essentially it represents the atmosphere. It's just a representation of the atmosphere. But the truth of the matter is it's also easier than cutting circles that fit perfectly. And again, I didn't want to spend a lot of time, if I didn't have to, doing that. But it was a design decision as well. You know, it's one of those techniques which look really great, but are actually relatively straightforward to do. For this project, it was a good choice, I think.
Is there a way to cut a really precise circle?
What I tend to do, if I am doing that, I tend to cut the inlay circle very slightly larger, just very slightly larger, because leather has that ability to be manipulated, provided it's not too thick or too stiff. It's a fraction of a millimetre. But if you go slightly on the large side rather than slightly on the small side, then it's going to hold. It's going to go in there. You can press it down. It'll butt up to the side of the hole that you've created. So, yeah, you can do it, but it takes some doing. And the other problem with that as well, with cutting circles, or at least with the method that I use, is you have the pin in the middle of the compass that you use to cut the circle. So you have to protect the circle, the inlay circle, from the pin of the compass. So I have to stick a piece of cardboard on the middle of the circle when I'm cutting it to prevent any problems with that. But you'll also notice on the inlaid circles that I've painted the outside edge of those as well, because you don't want to see raw leather on the outside of those circles. You'll see the end result there. You get that little channel. And that's why I wanted to have the full thickness leather, so you can actually see the thickness of the leather. And it's a very obvious recessed channel, I suppose.
And are the two leathers same thickness?
They are the same thickness, yes, or as close as. I didn't worry too much about it getting it absolutely right, because it actually doesn't matter too much. If it was a snug fit and if it was going right up to the edge of the cut circle, then it becomes a little bit more important that you don't want a lip at that point. So you have to get that exactly right. But yeah, these are approximately the same thickness. For the end papers, I used a spiderweb Lotka paper, which is a Nepalese paper, which I get from Boca Total in the Netherlands. It comes as the bottom one was the original, and then I sponged it with ink to give that sort of blotchy blue effect, again, just to mirror the rest of the binding. So I changed the colour of that, but I really like that material. I've used it a number of times for end papers. It's a beautiful semi-transparent or translucent paper. And in fact, if you look at the next slide, you'll see that in position. You'll also see on that the edge-to-edge leather doublure. You can just see it possibly. There is the vertical centre line of that doublure is paler than the outer edges.
Yeah.
And again, that's because I airbrushed it so that the foredge and the edge nearest the spine were darker, just to give it a little bit more interest. And right in the middle there, you see a tiny little blue leather inlay, which I just used a hole punch to produce. And that's a reference to Carl Sagan's pale blue dot, which is also referenced in the book. So just a little nod to that. And the same is on the back of the blur as well. That's the complete binding with all 16 circles there. Notice there's no titling on there. I very rarely put a title on my books. I do sometimes, but it has to be necessary in a way. Sometimes titles are, for me, can be kind of elbowed into a design when they shouldn't really be there. You know, it doesn't add anything to it. It needs to be part of the design if it's there.
And what about putting stuff on the spine? Not necessarily titles, but just...
Yeah, I mean, you can do. Yeah, I mean, it's just down to the design that you come up with. But like I say, often a title, to me, distracts from the rest of the design, particularly if it's a gold title. So there has to be a reason for it to be there. And the title is on the box, so, you know, and inside the book. So it's not necessary for it to have a title necessarily.
And if I turned this image 180 degrees, would you be able to tell which way it's supposed to be up?
Not really, no. The design would look very similar the other way up, actually. As far as the binding is concerned, frankly, it doesn't matter. You know, if it's the other way up, it really doesn't matter. It wouldn't bother me. That symmetry is quite nice in a way.
And actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it's appropriate for a space station. You don't know which way up is.
Yeah, I wish I thought of that. Yeah. Okay, so and that's the finished picture that you've already seen. So that's the sort of summary of the process. And then I've just got a few little slides just to show the prize-giving event that we had in London. In November, we had the prize-giving event when the winner was announced. So all of the 6 shortlisted authors were there with their entourage of publishers and so on. And at one side of the room was this display of the 6 design bindings of those books. There were some fabulous bindings, I have to say. I think all 6, you know, were really, really nice bindings and did the job. I've got to say, for me, the one that's closest to us there on the left-hand side, which was Kate Holland's binding, I just think is spectacular. I really, really like that binding. The amount of work that she did in getting colour and texture into the leather was spectacular. Love to know how she did some of that. So that was my favourite, just out of interest.
And you were able to see them close? Were you able to handle them?
We wouldn't handle them, no. I mean, obviously you could handle your own. And when we were introduced to our authors, we handled the book, our own book, and showed them, you know, the various features of it and explained the design, etc. But no, I think out of courtesy, you wouldn't handle other books.
Paul Sterling wrote, are these ends made, in quotes? If so, I assume the PVA needs to be applied with a roller to avoid seeing glue lines.
Yeah, I think Paul's referring to the Lotka end papers, the blue Lotka end papers. And actually, it wasn't a made end paper. That was simply glued with PVA along probably a 3mm strip at the spine edge. So that was actually a loose end paper. And as I say, it's a translucent sort of material. It's quite thick, but it's a translucent sort of material. So you can handle it like any other page. Just kind of like that effect on it.
From Jill Lauriston on YouTube. Is it possible to cut circles out of the board cover before the leather is put on, creating a recess onto which the circles could be stuck rather than cutting into the leather cover?
Yeah, so you end up with a sculpted board with recessed circles in. So yes, that would certainly mean you don't have to cut out the leather on the covering leather. And then what you would do is just cut a circle out that fits inside that recess. So yes, you could do that. It depends what effect you're after. You'd have to edge pair the circle that goes into it to avoid seeing a raw edge, but that's easily done. I wanted to see those sort of blue channels around the circles as a representation of the atmosphere. So that wouldn't have been appropriate in that. But yes, that certainly is an option. You could do that.
If you do such a recess, and usually, as far as I understand, it's done by layering cardboard. So you have a base layer of cardboard, then you have a layer of cardboard with cutouts, and you glue them together or, paste them together. If you put leather over such a step, there will be a sort of slope.
Yes.
You need to keep in mind that this slope will be there. So you either need to pair this leather, or you need to mitigate it in some other way by pairing the leather that you put on top, or you need to play around this slope and use it in your design. So
you're absolutely right. You would normally layer up extra layers with the shapes cut out or whatever. But in theory, if you've got a laminated board, you could actually cut the holes, a recess into the board if you wanted to, and particularly if you're using mill board, which delaminates quite nicely. That is another way to do it if you didn't want to add extra thickness to it.
You can quite often see photos on Facebook and other, I don't know, Instagram or other social networks of bookbinders with a bit less experience who use such a cutouts to create designs with recesses on their book cover with leather. And unfortunately, because of this slope, quite often they look, I wouldn't want to say unprofessional, but
no, they can look a bit chunky.
It's chunky. That's a good word. It's so much harder to make these bindings look sharp. You need to make a really conscious decision to use this as a part of your design and to play around it, so it wouldn't be chunky, but would be a real part of a design.
A couple of things with that, I think, is often the leather is too thick. And therefore you get the effect of that extra thickness causing problems. But I also think very often that the applied shapes that are used to create these effects, they're often too thick as well. They don't need to be thick. You can use some quite thin card to create that effect very successfully. So thin leather and thin onlaid card is the way to do that. And that helps to reduce that sort of chunkiness and the slope effect that you referred to, absolutely. Those are the 6 binders. So for those who don't know, it's Kate Holland on the left, myself, Nikki Oliver, Glenn Barkley, that's Richard Beadsmore, and on the right there is Mark Cochran, all looking very dapper.
And we are looking in the same order here on the books and on
yes,
the
we
binder.
are, you're right, yes. So those are the 6 authors, the 6 shortlisted authors, each holding their book for the camera. So they got to take those, they eventually would get those books to take away with them. They did go to Waterstones for a display first after the event. There's a lot of celebrity spotting going on. Those in the UK might recognise Lenny Henry there, but there's lots of celebrities, quite a lot of comedians for some reason. I'm not sure why, but a lot of people there. And that was the author. That's Samantha Harvey with her husband. The binders get to sit on the same table as their authors. So I was on Samantha's table, obviously. And that is a photograph taken in Waterstones after the event of the trophy that Samantha won. And my binding is there behind it, along with the other bindings, in a display cabinet in Waterstones' room. And they have a room, I don't know if it's there all the time, I suspect not, but they have had a room where it was just Booker bindings in the entire room from previous years as well as this year. So it's quite a display, I think. And that was in the centre of the room. I think that's the last slide.
I was wondering, Glenn, since at least 5 other binders were there and looking at your work, and so many of your colleagues, I assume, got to see it afterwards, what kind of feedback do you get after those kind of events?
Interestingly, I don't think we said an awful lot, to be honest. I mean, I did say to Kate that I particularly liked hers. We're all very respectful of each other's techniques and skills and capabilities, and I think in that sense we remain quite professional about it. Certainly if there was a binding that you didn't like, you wouldn't say so, naturally. I honestly liked all of the bindings, and I think at this sort of level it's very rare that a fellow would produce a binding that you thought wasn't very good. I mean, maybe you might not be keen on the design for some reason, but technically and artistically, we're all at a level where you would expect, a certain level, a certain quality. That's what you have to do in order to become a fellow Designer Bookbinders, and that's why we're invited to be involved in the book, I suppose. It's not something that you sort of go into detail. Having said that, we do all learn from each other. If there are techniques and approaches that another binder has used on a book, I certainly would be asking them how they do it, which is why I'm interested to see what Kate says, because I really want to know exactly how she did that leatherwork. But we all learn from each other. It's just the way things go,
That was quite insightful and very interesting and educational, and many thanks for that. Pasha wanted to ask some other projects Glenn worked on.
So I was wondering how your teaching was going.
Teaching, it's quite a large part of what I do now. And I do a number of types of teaching. I teach a workshop, a local workshop of up to 10 beginners in my nearby town, Hull. I do that once a month. There's different people each time, although some people come to most months sometimes. So those are one-day workshops, and I just do different kinds of book structures and so on. Occasionally it's a 2-day workshop. I also do workshops for the Society of Bookbinders, going around the various regions. I do some of that. Increasingly, I'm starting to do more one-to-one tuition. Not beginners so much as sort of intermediate level, really. People who are wanting perhaps to get into design bindings particularly. That's the sort of focus of what I want to do with a lot of my teaching. So I've got quite a few of those booked this year. In fact, probably enough to last another year. I think I've got 8 weeks worth of teaching for that, because they're sort of 1 week modules that I do. And happily people coming from all over the place. I've got somebody coming from Hong Kong, somebody coming from France, as well as the UK. So, it's somebody coming from Scandinavia as well, I think. It's nice to get an international element to it as well. And you can teach the technical side of design binding, and then you can explore together with the student what their ideas are in terms of the design and how that might be achieved. But it's a different kind of thing, really. It's two very separate areas. But certainly the technical side, and getting the detail of the technical side right, the forwarding and the quality of the boards and all those kind of things, working with the leather. But when you get to the design, one of the exercises I always get my students to do is, in the space of probably half an hour, to come up with 12 different designs. And I get them just to sit at a desk and just with a pen and paper and just scribble out as many designs as they can come up with. Invariably, from there comes 1 or 2 sparks of ideas that can then be taken forward and built upon and explored further and so on. It's a difficult thing to do, I think, because designs are so personal. I have to try really hard sometimes when I see somebody's design that they're really enthusiastic about, because sometimes I don't like it. I don't like the design, but that doesn't mean to say it's a bad design. It's just that it's not my cup of tea. So it's quite hard not to sort of be negative sometimes. That's just what you have to do as a teacher, really. When it comes to art and design, you have to let them develop their own style and do what they want to do. What I focus on is, if somebody is trying to produce a particular design, I will try to help them work out a way of getting the very best out of that approach, or using an alternative way to achieve something, or to make it more precise, for example, or whatever it might be. I'm very reluctant to tell somebody to come up with a different design because I don't like that one. That's not the right thing to do. It's a very personal thing. When it comes to design bindings, I think anybody can do it, but some people just do have a bit of an ability, a bit of a talent for it, I think.
Told us that you were phasing out the book restoration part of your business, but
Yeah.
do you continue to teach that, or did you ever teach that?
No, I very rarely, in fact, I can't think I've ever, maybe once taught restoration or book repair, actually, to be precise. I find it difficult to teach. You can do it perhaps on a one-to-one basis. Some people do group workshops with book repairs. I don't know how they do it, because every book is different, as you know. Every treatment that's required is different. And so I wouldn't know how you can give sufficient attention to each person's book to enable them to do a decent job of repairing it. So I've always steered clear of doing repair workshops. And although, to most bookbinders, repair is our bread and butter, that's what brings the money in, really. I've got to a point now where I can pull back from that a little bit. And, well, at the moment, I'm not doing any. That's not to say I won't do it in the future if something particularly interesting comes along. The problem with it is that whenever you've got a stack of books on the shelf looking for a repair, that's what you focus on. Those are the customers that need your attention. And the time you have for yourself to go and do a design binding or play about with a piece of artwork or something that you've been thinking about, you just don't do it. The real work gets in the way. So by removing the repair stuff, it's just freed up more time for me to focus on the design bindings, to focus on artwork and so on. It's like today, I have a concept for a binding that I'm thinking of at the minute, which involves an acrylic painting would be done by a palette knife. I've never done palette knife painting before. To have the time to play with that, as I have been doing this afternoon, is a real joy. And, you know, it may be terrible. I may never end up using it, but just having the time to try it and play with it and get ideas and so on is a really nice thing to be able to do. And you wouldn't be able to do that if you've got a customer's book waiting for repair. You just wouldn't.
It was great talking to you, Glenn. Thank you,
Yeah, you too.
for joining us. I hope I hope we will see you on our live stream once again in the future, maybe later this year, maybe next year, to discuss something else. And good luck with your projects. Good luck with your classes, with your teaching.
Thank you very much.
Have a great year.
Thank you, and you.
Thank you. Many thanks to our viewers just for joining us and for posting questions. That's it for today. We'll stay a bit longer while the stream drops. That's it. Have a good evening or have a good day if you are in the US or in the Americas.